Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into Learn Unity Beginner Intermediate 2024, a YouTube course by CodeMonkey.
Over 50 lectures.
Yeah, over 50. It's a lot to get through, but
Ton of info.
yeah, but there are a lot of golden nuggets in there.
Right.
And that's what we're going to extract today.
Right.
So I'm excited to kind of pick your brain
Awesome.
and figure out, how we can use these things to make our games better.
Yeah. Even for experienced developers, there are little things in there that you might miss or forget about. It's always good to go back to basics.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why his courses are so successful. It's like he starts from a real, ground zero
Yeah.
beginner level,
Yeah.
but then he builds on it in a very logical way. So let's say you were brand new to Unity.
Okay.
What are some of the first things that CodeMonkey really emphasizes?
Well, one of the first big things is separating your visuals from your game logic.
Okay, now that's interesting because when you're first starting out, you might think, well, it's all part of the game, so why should I separate it?
Right. Yeah, and it's one of those things that's kind of counterintuitive at first, because as a beginner, you're just trying to get anything to work, right?
Yeah.
But as your project scales and you're adding more complex features, you're going to really regret it if you don't have that separation from the beginning.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like,
You can think of it
go ahead.
like a house, right? If your plumbing is running through your living room, that's not a very maintainable house.
No, not at all. I wouldn't want to renovate that house.
Exactly. So by separating the visuals, which is what the player sees from the logic, which is how the game actually works, you're essentially future-proofing your project.
Okay, so you're setting yourself up for success down the line.
Exactly.
That's a great point. Now, another thing that he's really adamant about is using the new input system in Unity.
Oh, yeah. He's very big on that.
Yes.
And for good reason. The legacy input system, while it might seem simpler at first glance, it just has so many limitations, especially when it comes to supporting different types of controllers.
Like gamepads.
Exactly. Gamepads, joysticks, VR controllers, you name it.
Which is essential these days.
Absolutely.
Because if you're making a game, you really want to support as many different input devices as possible.
Yeah, you don't want to limit your player base.
Right. So the new input system, while it might have a slightly steeper learning curve, it's going to save you a lot of headache in the long run.
Yeah, you're going to be much happier that you made that decision up front.
Okay, good to know. Now let's talk about something that can be a bit of a sticking point, especially for beginners. Good coding style.
Ah, yes. The art of clean code.
Yeah, I think it's tempting to think, oh, it works, so who cares if it's a bit messy? But CodeMonkey really stresses the importance of writing code that's not only functional, but also readable and maintainable.
Yeah, and he has good reason to stress that, because especially when you're working on larger projects or if you're collaborating with other people, bad coding style can become a huge liability.
Because then you can't understand what's going on.
It's like trying to read a book where every other sentence is in a different language.
Yeah. So what are some specific things that he emphasizes when it comes to good coding style?
Well, for one, he's a big stickler for naming conventions.
Right.
So using meaningful variable names, function names, avoiding cryptic abbreviations, things like that. It might seem small, but it makes a huge difference.
I can imagine, especially when you're dealing with hundreds or even thousands of lines of code.
Exactly.
It's like organizing your tools in your workshop, right?
Exactly. If everything has its place and is clearly labeled, you're going to be much more efficient.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're just spending all your time searching for that one wrench, you have somewhere.
And getting frustrated in the process. And that's definitely something we want to avoid in game development.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another concept that CodeMonkey really emphasizes: refactoring.
Ah, refactoring. It's one of those things that might seem tedious in the moment, but it pays off in the long run.
Could you explain what refactoring is for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term?
Sure. It's essentially restructuring your code without changing what it does.
Okay, so it's like cleaning up your code.
Exactly. It's like you've built a house and it's functional, but maybe the layout isn't ideal or there are some inefficiencies. Refactoring is like going back and rearranging things to make it work better.
Okay. So in the context of the course, do you have any examples of where CodeMonkey does this?
Yeah, actually, a great example is when he replaces the legacy input system with the new one in the middle of the project.
Oh, okay.
He does this to demonstrate that even though it might seem like extra work at the time, it's going to save you so much trouble later on.
Because if you try to do that later, after you'd already built a bunch of stuff on top of the old system.
Oh, it would be a nightmare.
Yeah. Okay, so refactoring is like investing in good tools and organization early on,
Absolutely.
which pays dividends later down the road.
Exactly. It's all about making your life easier as a developer.
And who doesn't want that?
Right. Especially when you're dealing with the complexities of game development.
Now let's dive into some more
是吧？
specifics about how
Mm.
CodeMonkey approaches game development. One of the things that I was fascinated by was his treatment of collision detection.
Oh, yeah. Collision detection is a fundamental aspect of any game.
Right. Because that's how the game world knows that things are interacting with each other.
Exactly.
So
Like your player character bumping into a wall or picking up an object or, getting hit by a projectile.
right, right. So how does he approach that?
Well, he starts with a very simple approach, using what's called a raycast.
Okay.
And imagine shooting a laser beam out from your character to see if it hits anything. That's essentially what a raycast is doing.
Okay. It's like an invisible laser beam
Exactly.
coming out from the character.
Right. And for simple interactions, that can work fine. But as he points out, raycasts have limitations, especially when you're dealing with player characters.
Okay. Like what kind of limitations?
Well, a raycast is infinitely thin.
Ah,
So if your character is represented by anything more than a single point, there's a chance they could actually pass through objects if the raycast just happens to miss.
like clipping through a wall.
Exactly. And that's not a very good player experience.
No, not at all. Breaks the immersion.
So he then introduces the concept of a capsule cast, which is basically like a thicker ray cast, more like a cylinder.
Ah,
And this more accurately represents the shape of a player character, so you get much more reliable collision detection.
and a smoother gameplay experience.
Exactly.
I see. Now let's talk about something that can be a bit of a stumbling block for beginners and even some experienced developers. C-sharp interfaces.
Oh, yes. Interfaces, they can seem a bit abstract and confusing at first.
They do. Like, what is this? What is this thing?
Right. But CodeMonkey does a great job of demystifying them with a practical example. He uses an interface called iKitchen Object Parent in his game.
Okay. Now, for those of us who are not familiar with C-sharp interfaces, can you explain what this particular interface does in the context of his game?
Sure. So imagine you have counters in your game, right?
Yeah.
And you want to be able to place different objects on them, plates, containers, cutting boards, whatever.
Right.
Without an interface, you would have to write separate code for how each object interacts with each type of counter.
Oh, that sounds messy.
It is. It gets very repetitive and hard to maintain. But with this iKitchen Object Parent interface, all those objects can adhere to a common set of rules for how they interact with counters.
Ah, okay. So it's like a set of guidelines that all these different objects follow,
Exactly.
and that makes the code much cleaner
Much cleaner, much more flexible.
and easier to expand on.
Exactly. So if you want to add a new type of object later, you don't have to rewrite a bunch of code. You just have to make sure it implements that interface.
Ah, I see. So it's kind of like having a universal adapter.
Exactly.
You can plug in all sorts of different things as long as they conform to that same standard.
I love that analogy. That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, so interfaces, while they might seem confusing at first, can actually make your code much more organized and maintainable.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that once you understand it, you realize how powerful it is.
Yeah, it's like a level up moment.
It is. It's like you've unlocked a new skill in your game development journey.
That's great. Now, it's interesting because this deep dive is focused on coding, but CodeMonkey mentions that he actually has other courses for people who are more interested in visual scripting.
Yeah, he does. And that's a really cool option for people who might be intimidated by traditional coding.
Right, so even if you don't feel comfortable writing code, you can still create games in Unity.
Absolutely. There are so many different tools and approaches out there. It's all about finding what works best for you.
That's great. Now, speaking of tools, I was really fascinated by his use of shader graph.
Oh, yeah. Shootergraph is an awesome tool.
It is. It's like visual magic.
It is. It lets you create shaders without writing any code. So you can visually manipulate materials and how they react to light, all sorts of cool effects.
Right. He uses it to create this really cool moving arrow in his game.
Yeah, and he really stresses that that's just scratching the surface of what Shadergraph can do. You can create realistic water, flowing lava, shimmering surfaces.
And it's all done visually.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's a very intuitive and powerful tool.
It's like opening up a whole world of visual possibilities, even if you're not comfortable with traditional shader programming.
Exactly. It's democratizing game development.
That's great. Now, let's move on to a topic that I think is really important, especially for beginners. The art of polishing your game.
Ah, yes. The polish. This is where the game really starts to shine.
It is. It's like taking a good game and making it great.
Exactly. It's all about the details. He goes into adding environmental details like foliage, rocks, props, those little things that make the game world feel more alive.
It's like adding those finishing touches to a painting.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
about creating a sense of place and atmosphere.
Right. And he also talks about the power of particle systems.
Oh, particle systems are awesome. They're used for effects like fire, smoke, explosions, anything that involves a lot of small moving particles.
Right. And they can add so much dynamism and visual interest to a scene.
They really can. He shows you how to create a simple particle system for sparks when the player cuts an ingredient, and then he goes into more complex systems like the smoke rising from the stove.
It's amazing how much those little details can add to the player experience.
They really do. It's all about creating a sense of immersion.
And he doesn't stop there. He also delves into UI animations, making those menus and buttons feel snappy and responsive.
UI animations can make such a big difference in terms of how polished the game feels.
They do. It's like the difference between a clunky old website and a modern, smooth-scrolling one.
Exactly. It's about making the interface feel intuitive and enjoyable to use.
Right. And one of the things I really appreciate is that he emphasizes that these polishing techniques are achievable, even for beginners.
Absolutely. You don't need to be a 3D modeling wizard or an animation expert to make your game look and feel good. There are so many free and affordable assets available online, and Unity has some great built-in tools for creating effects and animations.
Right. So it's about being resourceful and using the tools at your disposal to create a really polished and engaging experience for your players.
Exactly. It's about having that attention to detail and that desire to make your game the best it can be.
And that's really what separates the hobbyists from the professionals.
It is. It's about going that extra mile and paying attention to those little details that make all the difference.
Yeah, it really does. And, this mindset of thinking ahead and, building for the future, it's really apparent in how CodeMonkey approaches something like collision detection,
Okay.
which is, one of those fundamental things you need to get right in any game.
Yeah, collisions are how the game world knows that things are interacting with each other. So, like your character bumping into walls, picking up objects, getting hit by projectiles.
Right.
It seems pretty straightforward, but you would think so.
Yeah.
But getting it to feel right is a whole other challenge.
Yeah.
And the kind of naive approach, if you will, is to use something called a raycast.
Okay.
So imagine shooting a laser beam out from your character to see if it hits anything.
Okay.
That's essentially what a raycast is.
Like an invisible laser beam
Exactly.
coming out from the player.
Yeah, and for simple interactions, that can work fine. But as CodeMonkey points out, raycasts have limitations, especially when you're dealing with player characters.
What kind of limitations?
Well, a raycast is infinitely thin.
Okay.
So if your character is represented by anything more than a single point, there's a chance that they could actually pass through objects if the raycast just happens to miss.
Oh, like you're clipping through a wall or something.
Exactly. And that's, not exactly the kind of immersive experience we're going for.
No, it's very jarring.
Right. So that's why he introduces this concept of a capsule cast,
Okay.
which is basically a thicker raycast,
More like a cylinder.
more like a cylinder or a capsule shape, right? And that more accurately represents the shape of the player. So you get more reliable collision detection and a much smoother gameplay experience.
Got it. So it's those seemingly small technical choices that
That make a huge difference in how the game feels.
it's that attention to detail
Exactly.
that really, I think, separates
Yeah,
the hobbyists from the pros.
for sure. Speaking of kind of professional techniques, one that often trips up beginners is the use of interfaces in C#.
Oh, yeah.
They can seem kind of abstract and confusing at first.
Yeah, it's like, what is this thing?
Right. You look
yeah.
at the code and it's like, what is it even doing?
Yeah.
But CodeMonkey does a great job of demystifying them. With a practical example, he uses an interface called iKitchenObjectParent.
Okay, break that down for me.
Okay.
What does that actually do in the context of the game?
So think about it this way. You've got counters in your game, and you want to be able to place different objects on them. Plates, containers, cutting boards. Without an interface, you would have to write separate code for how each object interacts with each type of counter.
That sounds messy.
It is.
Okay.
But with the iKitchenObjectParent interface, all of those objects can adhere to a common set of rules for how they interact with counters.
Ah, so it's like,
So it's
yeah,
it makes the code much cleaner, more flexible, and easier to extend.
so you could add like a new object later
Yes,
and
you don't
you
need
wouldn't
to
have
say-
to rewrite as much code.
You got it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
It's like having a universal adapter, right? You can plug in all sorts of different devices because they conform to the same standard.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a really good example of how a little bit of abstraction up front can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Yeah, and this kind of thinking. This is what sets apart the the beginners from the more experienced developers, right?
Absolutely.
It's thinking ahead. It's
Thinking
designing your code to be adaptable, scalable.
You got it. You know, it's interesting that even though this deep dive is focused on coding, CodeMonkey mentions that he has other courses for those who are interested in visual scripting.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a completely codeless way to develop games in Unity.
Really? So you don't need to know.
You don't have to write a single line of code.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
It is. It opens up game development to a much wider audience.
That's awesome.
Yeah, even those who might be intimidated by traditional coding, there are tools out there
Yeah,
that can help you achieve your game dev goals.
that's great. Speaking of powerful tools, I was fascinated by his use of shader graph.
Oh yeah, Shader Graph is amazing,
It is. It lets you create shaders without writing any code.
right?
Like, how is that even possible?
I know, it's crazy, but it's this visual tool where you can connect nodes and create all sorts of cool effects for your materials.
So you can control how things look, how they react to light,
Exactly.
all without writing a single line of code.
It's so powerful, and he uses it in the course to create a cool moving arrow.
Yeah, I saw that.
And he emphasizes that it's just scratching the surface, you know? You can create realistic water, flowing lava, shimmering surfaces. The possibilities are endless.
It's really impressive. So that's something that even beginners can start experimenting with.
Absolutely. And it's a lot of fun, too. You can get really creative with it.
That's great. Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that I think is crucial for any game developer, but especially beginners. The art of polishing your game.
Oh, yeah. The polish. This is where the game really comes together.
Yeah, it's like taking a functional game and making it feel amazing to play.
Exactly. It's all about those little details that make the experience more immersive and enjoyable.
So what kind of things does CodeMonkey cover in terms of polishing?
Well, he talks about a lot of things. Adding environmental details like foliage, rocks, props, those little things that make the game world feel more lived in and believable.
It's like set dressing, right?
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be super complex. Even simple things can make a big difference.
Right. And then there's particle systems.
Oh yeah, particle systems are a must-have for any game. They're used for effects like fire, smoke, explosions, magic spells, all sorts of cool things.
And they can add so much visual flair and excitement to a scene.
Absolutely. He shows you how to create a simple particle system for sparks when the player cuts an ingredient, and then he goes into more complex systems like the smoke rising from the stove.
It's amazing how much those little details can add to the player's experience.
They really do. It's all about creating a sense of immersion and making the game world feel more alive.
Now, you mentioned UI animations earlier, and I think that's another key aspect of polishing.
Oh, absolutely. UI animations can make a huge difference in terms of how polished and professional a game feels. He shows you how to make those menus and buttons feel snappy and responsive, how to add transitions and effects, all sorts of cool stuff.
It's like the difference between using a clunky old website and a modern, smooth-scrolling one.
Exactly. It's about making the interface feel intuitive and enjoyable to use, and it can really elevate the overall experience.
Now, as you progress through the course and your game starts to take shape, one of the things that can feel really daunting is handling player interactions.
Oh yeah, this is where things can get tricky, especially for beginners.
It's about making the player feel like they're really interacting with the game world.
Exactly. Like picking up objects, using tools, triggering events, all that good stuff.
Right. It's what separates a passive experience from an active one.
And CodeMonkey starts by introducing a fundamental technique called ray casting.
Okay, we talked about that earlier.
He did with collision detection.
Yeah, it's like shooting that invisible laser beam for
Exactly.
the player's perspective to see what they're pointing at.
And in this context, he uses it to build the core interaction system for the game, selecting counters, picking up ingredients, performing actions, all of that.
Okay.
But as the game grows more complex, ray casting alone isn't enough. You need more nuanced interactions, like cutting ingredients, placing objects on plates, combining items, things like that. And that's where the power of inheritance and interfaces really shines.
So it's about building upon those foundational concepts.
Exactly.
We talked about earlier clean code, good structure, using interfaces effectively.
You got it.
it all starts to come together.
It does. It's like building a house. You start with the foundation, and then you add the walls and the roof and all the details.
And eventually you have this beautiful functional structure.
Exactly. And, one of the key tools he introduces for managing these more complex interactions is the concept of events in C#.
Okay, now events can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around.
They can, yeah, especially at first.
What's the simplest way to explain them?
Well, think of them as a way for different parts of your code to communicate with each other without being directly connected.
Okay.
So instead of having objects constantly checking on each other to see if something has changed, they can just listen for specific events and react accordingly.
So it's like setting up a system of alarms. If something happens,
Right.
then the relevant parts of the code are notified.
Right. Like if the player interacts with a counter,
Right.
certain things might happen as a result of that.
Okay, that makes sense.
It makes your code more efficient and easier to understand, and it's a very common pattern in professional game development.
That's a good concept to learn early on.
Absolutely. It'll make your life as a game developer much easier. It really is. Yeah, it's like you said, it's not just about the technical aspects of putting the game together. It's about how it actually feels when you're playing it.
Right, and that's something that I think beginners often overlook.
Oh, for sure.
They're so focused on getting the code to work.
Yeah, just making it work.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
they forget about those little details.
Yeah, and CodeMonkey, to his credit, he really emphasizes that throughout the course.
He does.
It's like, don't just make it functional.
Make it feel good.
Yeah, make it feel good to play. And he even spends time refining something as simple as the movement of the player character.
Oh, yeah, like how the character accelerates and decelerates.
Yeah.
It's not just about moving from point A to point B.
Right.
It's about how that movement feels. It's about giving the character a sense of weight.
It's like the difference between, a car that just kind of jerks around
Yeah, like a clunky car.
and a car that has a really smooth, responsive...
Suspension.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that can make all the difference in terms of how much you enjoy playing a game.
Absolutely. It's about immersion, you know?
Right.
You want the player to feel like they're really in that world.
Yeah, you want them to forget that they're controlling a digital character.
Exactly.
And just feel like they're,
part of that world.
yeah, part of that experience.
And he also talks about the importance of visual feedback.
Okay.
Making sure that the player can see the results of their actions.
Give me an example.
Like when the player picks up an object, there's a little animation that shows the object being grasped.
Ah.
So it's not just like, poof, the object is in their hand.
Right.
There's a visual representation of that action.
And that makes it feel more believable.
Exactly. And more satisfying for the player.
Now, as the game progresses, CodeMonkey introduces more complex gameplay elements,
Right.
like managing a kitchen and fulfilling customer orders.
Yeah, it starts to get into more the game design aspect.
And this is where those earlier lessons about structuring your code and using events really come into play, right?
Absolutely. It's all about building a system that's modular and extensible.
Okay.
So you can easily add new recipes, new ingredients, new kitchen appliances without having to rewrite huge chunks of code.
So you're not constantly having to go back and kind of like hack things together.
Right, exactly.
You've got this nice clean structure that you can build upon.
And that's so important, especially as your game grows in complexity.
Right, because if you don't have that good
Like,
foundation,
so it's going to fall apart.
yeah, it's going to become a nightmare to maintain.
Exactly.
So thinking ahead is really important.
It really is, yeah. And, one of the things that I really appreciate is how CodeMonkey, he doesn't just focus on the technical stuff.
Right.
He also delves into, like, game design concepts.
Give me an example.
Like, he talks about creating a scoring system,
Okay.
which might seem like a simple thing, but a good scoring system can really add depth and replayability to a game.
Right, because it gives players a sense of progress.
Exactly. And something to strive for.
Yeah, some kind of goal.
Yeah, he shows you how to create a simple scoring system that tracks the number of recipes the player has successfully completed.
Okay.
And then he even introduces like a timer,
Ah, okay.
which adds a sense of urgency and challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's not just about completing the recipes, it's about completing them quickly and efficiently.
And that can completely change the feel of the game.
Absolutely.
Right.
And another thing that he does really well is he emphasizes the importance of sound.
Oh, yeah. Sound is so important in games.
It's crucial. It can really make or break the atmosphere.
Absolutely, yeah.
He shows you how to add sound effects
Okay.
for things like cutting ingredients, placing objects, completing recipes, those little details that really bring the game to life.
Yeah. It's amazing how much a well-placed sound effect can enhance
Yeah.
the player experience.
Oh, absolutely. It's like, when you watch a movie and there's a really good sound design,
Yeah.
it just sucks you
It
in.
makes it so much more immersive.
Exact.
Yeah, and then there's the music.
Oh, the music.
That's like the emotional backbone.
It sets the mood. He
Yeah.
shows you how to add background music to the game and how to choose music that fits the tone and the theme.
Right.
And Unity actually makes it really easy to work with audio.
Does it?
Yeah. There are built-in tools for importing sound files, controlling volume, and all that stuff.
That's great.
So you don't have to be a sound engineer to create a really immersive audio experience.
That's fantastic. Well,
Mhm.
as we come to the end of this deep dive, I'm just struck by how much ground we've covered.
I know, it's been a journey.
It really has. We've gone from the very basics of Unity all the way to polishing and adding sound and really thinking about the game design aspect.
It's the whole shebang.
It is. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I really appreciate about CodeMonkey's approach is that he emphasizes that game development is a continuous learning process.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not about, knowing everything from the start.
Yeah, there's always something new to learn.
Exactly.
New tools, new techniques, new ways of thinking.
And it's really about, being curious and experimenting and not being afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's how you learn.
Exactly. And CodeMonkey, I think he does a really good job of creating a safe space for learning.
He does. He's very encouraging.
Yeah.
And he makes it clear that it's okay to make mistakes.
Which is so important, especially for beginners.
Yeah, because game development can be intimidating,
It can be.
especially when you're first starting out.
Yeah, you're looking at all this code and all these tools, and it's like, oh my God, where do I even begin?
Right, but he breaks it down into manageable steps.
He does.
And he makes it fun.
He does. He does.
And that's really what it's all about.
It is, and I think that's why his courses are so popular.
Yeah, people really respond to his teaching style.
They do.
He's a natural teacher.
He is. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, I think so too.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We had.
and we've learned a lot from CodeMonkey.
Absolutely.
So to all of you aspiring game developers out there, I say, go for it. Don't be afraid to dive in and start creating.
Yeah, there's a whole world of possibilities out there waiting for you.
And you never know. You might just create the next big hit.
You never know, and even if you don't,
Yeah,
the journey itself is incredibly rewarding.
it is. It's so much fun to create something from nothing.
Absolutely.
So keep learning, keep experimenting, and most importantly, keep playing.
That's what it's all about.
That's all for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.